Hello everyone, this is your friend Shinobi Nexus 2.0. Welcome back to the channel. Enjoy the fanfic. And let's begin. Part 4. Besides the usual glares and sneers from the villagers, the trip to the academy was largely uneventful. They slipped into the school building with more than a little apprehension. It had been almost a week since they'd last been there, and there was no telling how the children would react to their prolonged absence. Tayuya nodded towards the door and gave the subtle command for Naruto to slide it open. There was no guarantee that they'd make it out alive. Hell, there was no guarantee that they'd make it out at all. After saying a quick prayer to Kami-sama, they stepped into the room and braced themselves. Tayuya-sensei, Naruto-sensei, they're back, one of the kids yelled, pointing excitedly towards the door. At that moment, a large group of sniveling, ecstatic 5-year-olds rushed towards them at Mach 5 speeds. It took every ounce of the girl's willpower not to turn around and get the out of there, and she wondered if her fellow genin was feeling the same way. They dragged the teens into the room and slid the door shut behind them, ultimately sealing their fates. This time, the children wasted no time in forcing Tayuya to sit in the small, plush chair endearingly dubbed as the princess's throne, and shoved a large red storybook into her hands. She watched amazed as the toddlers moved like clockwork, grabbing pillows, blankets, and various other toys to help make themselves comfortable. Even if they were little demons, she had to admit that they were organized. A small pressure on her lap snapped her out of her thoughts, and she glanced down to see the same small, brown-haired girl from the week before making herself comfortable against her body. "Why do you always sit in my lap?" Tayuya asked, staring down at the girl with a small frown. The girl lifted her large, brown eyes up to meet the redhead's own, and with an annoyingly cute smile, she answered. "You feel like my mommy." A stifled chuckle was heard to her left, and she turned her head to glare menacingly at Naruto. Unfortunately, the effect was lessened by the light flush of her cheeks. Almost ripping the book in half, she opened it and buried her face within the pages to hide her emberment. "So, does anyone remember where we left off?" She ground out through clenched teeth, resisting the incredibly strong urge to punch the smug-looking blonde in the face. 24 hands shot up into the air, one of them belonging to Naruto. She nodded towards a sickly boy that she recognized as Jin. The snake was just about to kill the fox for getting in his way. Tayuya nodded and flipped a few pages until she found it. Here, she held up the book towards the kids, and when they all nodded simultaneously, she cleared her throat slightly and began to read. Frowning, the snake launched himself at the wounded fox. "I told you not to meddle, and now you shall die." Before he could sink his fangs into the fox, a strong, white light shot out from the fox and covered him in an angelic glow. The fox could feel the power surging through him, and with a mighty growl, he jumped to attack the snake. The children gasped in surprise at the sudden turn of events, causing Tayuya to snicker at their awestruck expressions. She'd forgotten just how amusing it was to watch their faces twist and turn with each new page. After dodging the snake's bite, the fox ducked under his belly, killed the snake with a strong swipe to the stomach. As soon as she was sure he was dead, the princess rushed over to the fox and gave him a big hug. "Oh, thank you, fox," the princess said, snuggling up against his fur. "Thank you for saving me from that evil snake." The fox only shook his head and smiled. "You are my friend, princess, and I will always protect you." Walking hand in hand, the redhead idly wondered what the hell kind of fox had hands instead of paws. The fox and princess strode through the forest together towards the wizard's house to tell him all about their victorious battle. The end. Tayuya glanced up from her book to gauge their reactions. For 5 seconds, no one moved. Each of the children had a different expression on their face. Some were amazed, some were terrified, and a few of them even had the beginnings of tears in their eyes. Even though she thought she'd done a good job in reading the story, she certainly wasn't expecting the loud wave of applause and cheers that reached her ears. You're the best reader ever. One of them exclaimed, standing up to embrace her in a hug. She tensed momentarily at the unusual feeling, but eventually relaxed enough to awkwardly wrap her arm around his shoulders. Thanks, she replied, giving him a slight squeeze. Unfortunately, that simple action only encouraged the rest of the children to try the same. A crowd of students rushed her at full speed to receive a hug of their own. I want a hug too. Me next. Me next. Hey, no skipping. Tayuya's face was visibly uncomfortable, and she looked over towards her only ally for help. Much to her chagrin, said ally was currently rolling on the ground, laughing at her predicament. Naruto. She yelled over the crowd of noisy 5-year-olds, help me. Naruto considered leaving her alone to deal with the children by herself, but the pleading look in her eyes made him change his mind. Even if this wasn't exactly a battle, he was never one to abandon a comrade in need. With a sigh of resignation, he stood up and walked over to one of the cupboards in the CL room. He then pulled out a box of cookies and took a deep breath. Who wants cookies? He yelled, raising the box high above his head. The effect was immediate. The swarm of children quickly forgot about their quest to receive a hug from the redhead, and instantly encircled Naruto to receive their snack. Naturally, sugar dominated everything else. First, you have to sit down at your tables. They wasted no time in getting settled in the tiny chairs, and 5 minutes later, he finished laying out cookies and milk for the kids to eat. I thought I was a goner. Tayuya breathed, absent-mindedly brushing herself off. Except for training, she'd rarely received any kind of physical contact from anyone in the sound. Sadly, most of it was from Orochimaru. Receiving any kind of physical affection, especially from a writhing M of flesh and snot, was well above her comfort level. She glanced up at the clock hanging over the door and frowned. We were supposed to leave 10 minutes ago. It's already 1 o'clock in the afternoon. He nodded and handed the girl her crutches. Are you coming back tomorrow? A small voice asked as she stood up. They both glanced down to see the sickly young boy from before, Jin, staring up at them with wide eyes. Looking over his head, the genin realized that the entire CL was waiting on a reply. Naruto grinned sadly at the children. Sorry, me and Tayuya-sensei are gonna be gone for a while. The 5-year-olds' faces immediately dropped into a frown. For how long? One of the children asked from the back of the CL room. Both teens tensed slightly at the question. There was no doubt in either of their minds that the kids wouldn't like what they would have to say. Tayuya slowly began backing towards the door, just in case the little bastards decided to attack. 3 years. At once, a loud chorus of whines and shouts filled the room. You can't go for that long. You're our favorite senseis ever. Jin whimpered, still staring at them with puppy eyes. The redhead rolled her eyes and turned to address the kids. It was obvious that with Naruto trying to explain things, they'd never leave. We'll be back before you know it. While we're gone, I expect each and every one of you to become strong shinobi of the leaf. Is that clear? She asked, fixing them with a stern glare. The children stared up at her in confusion before sharing determined nods amongst themselves. Hi, Tayuya-sensei. They shouted in unison. With a final wave goodbye, the 2 genin slipped out of the room. That night, 21 sets of parents had a heart attack when their children proudly proclaimed that they wanted to become Konoha ninja. Where did that come from? Naruto asked, raising an eyebrow at the redhead hobbling along at his side. They'd just left the academy, and after 5 or so minutes of deliberating, decided to take a stroll through the market district to kill some time. Where did what come from? The redhead shot back. The blonde scrunched up his face in thought. You know, that thing where you told all of the kids to become Konoha shinobi. I thought you hated this place. Tayuya shrugged as best she could on the wooden crutches. I do, but if I have to live in this shithole for the rest of my goddamn life, I want to be at least somewhat safe. The more ninja the better, right? The blonde nodded his agreement. He had to admit that she had a point, even if it was for the wrong reasons. He casually placed his hands behind his head and looked up at the cloudy blue sky. Konoha was at its prettiest around this time of year. I guess. So, what do you want to do now? He asked, trying to pick shapes out of the clouds floating above his head. The majority of them just looked like large white balls of cotton, and he could never understand why Shikamaru loved staring at them so much. After a 5-second wait for her answer, he eventually turned his eyes to look at her. Tayuya. To his surprise, the fiery redhead was nowhere to be seen. Panicking slightly, he immediately turned around to see if she tripped or fallen when he wasn't looking. He felt his panic rise another level when he realized she wasn't anywhere near him. A million thoughts began to run through his head. Had someone kidnapped her? Was it another sound ninja coming to finish the job? Did she ditch him? Shaking his head, he scratched the last item off of the list. She'd had a hard enough time simply walking with the crutches, so there was no way she could have disappeared on her own in such a short amount of time. He quickly retraced his steps, looking into every single dark alley and side street on the path back to the academy. Where the hell is she? He thought, his mind racing with possibilities. Just as he was about to give up after nearly 15 minutes of searching, a large white sign in one of the store windows caught his eye. He rushed over to window and breathed a small sigh of relief when he read the bright red letters painted crudely on the poster board. Going out of business sale. 50% off on all instruments and supplies. Of course, if he remembered correctly, Tayuya had used a flute as her main weapon. He also remembered that he hadn't seen her with a flute since he'd met her 2 weeks ago. Taking a deep breath, he slowly pushed the door to the shop open and stepped inside the dimly lit room. Despite there being a huge sale on instruments and supplies, the store was still crowded with guitars, drums, cymbals, and a whole bunch of other instruments he'd never seen before. There didn't seem to be any particular order to the way the items were arranged, and large brown boxes littered the floor of the shop. He couldn't see much from the doorway except for a ridiculous amount of shelves and bookcases. In the back of his mind, he wondered how many people had died trying to find their way out of the junky recesses of the store. Hello, an older woman croaked, smiling widely at him from behind the counter. Her hair was just starting to gray, and her clothes looked worn but comfortable. A small pair of glees were perched dexterously on the tip of her nose and were connected to a small golden chain hanging around her neck. Welcome to the. A small frown marred her face when she finally got a good look at his whisker marks. What do you want? Naruto felt the corners of his mouth twitch downwards, but quickly masked it with the widest possible smile he could muster. Sorry to bother you, but I'm just looking for my friend. Did a girl with red hair come in here? He asked, trying to be as respectful as possible. The woman eyed him suspiciously. Why, what if I have? She shot back. Before he could answer, an excited shout reached his ears from somewhere within the M.of.B.R. and wood. Naruto. Naruto, is that you? Get your over here quick. He recognized the voices Tayuya's and let loose the breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Shooting the old woman a nervous smile, he gingerly stepped into the old shop and attempted to find his way to the voice hidden among the shelves. Still eyeing him suspiciously, the shop owner shouted over to Tayuya. You know this boy? Yeah, he's the I told you about before, the one that helped me out with my legs. She scowled from her place in the back of the store and waved one of her crutches in the air to help him pinpoint her location. Where the hell are you? Hurry up and get the over here. I can't. It's like a maze in here. The blonde replied, doing his best to find a way out. Every time he thought he was close to the girl, another bookshelf or pile of boxes stood in his way. A loud sigh was heard from the direction of the front desk, followed by the sound of tired footsteps. Hold your horses, I'll help you get there. In less than a minute, the woman skillfully found her way to stressed blonde and motioned for him to follow her. I swear, you young shinobi are hopeless, relying on brute strength instead of brains to get through life. In my day, we were taught to think before we acted, and to go into every battle with a set plan. Naruto ed an eyebrow in curiosity. You were a kunoichi? He asked, thoroughly surprised. She didn't look all that impressive, and at first glance, one would never know. Still navigating through the store's maze, she nodded. Pa, I was one of the best genjutsu specialists of my time. That red-eyed girl, what's her name? Kurenai can't compare to the level one was at when I was her age. Hell, I could put that Itachi brat in an illusion so fierce he'd be down on his knees begging for me to hurry up and kill him. The image of the stoic and powerful Itachi begging to be put out of his misery was too much for the boy, and he balefully chuckled softly to himself. The only thing I couldn't stop with my genjutsu is that damn nine-tailed fox. A shame, too, since he killed both my parents and my husband. Naruto lowered his head slightly at her words. Even though he had nothing to do with the Kyuubi's attack on the village, he still felt a small amount of guilt for even keeping it alive inside of him. He thought he heard a snort in the back of his mind, but brushed it off when the woman pointed towards an opening ahead of them. Ah, here we are. They walked around a corner to see a wall completely covered with flutes. There were flutes of all different lengths, types, material, and colors hanging on the large slab of wood. Staring enviously up at the wide ornament of wind instruments was a cheery-eyed Tayuya. Naruto, look, they have many here. He watched her face as she studied each and every individual flute, and was surprised at what he saw. Her face was completely different from what he used to seeing, and there wasn't a trace of anger or hatred on her angular features. It was almost like looking at a completely separate individual. The owner stepped up beside the girl to look up at the ornament with her. Do you know what you're looking for? She asked, clasping her hands loosely behind her back. Tayuya nodded slowly and pointed up at a simple copper flute resting near the top of the display. There didn't appear to be anything special about it, and the old woman frowned deeply at her choice. You want that? What? The redhead asked, taken aback at her tone of voice. Why the not? It's the only battle flute I see up here. A small spark appeared in the woman's eye, and a smirk slowly made its way onto her face. Ah, it's a battle flute you're looking for. Why didn't you say so? You know, I used one too when I was still on active duty, and I've collected quite a few over the years. Both teens watched as she smoothly walked over to a small door built next to the wall. She opened the door and stepped inside, piquing their curiosity. Are you ready? She called from inside the room. Naruto glanced at Tayuya and shrugged. Sure. A few seconds after the words left his mouth, the wall in front of them pivoted and turned to reveal another large wall filled with flutes. The only difference was that they were all built for battle. He could literally feel the waves of shock and excitement pouring off of the girl at his side, and she wasted no time in hobbling up to the wall for a closer look. Holy shit! She exclaimed, eyes wide with surprise. Where the did all of these come from? The woman chuckled as she emerged from the doorway. Well, it's pretty rare for someone to come in and look for battle flutes. In fact, I've only had one other customer in the past 20 years. She paused to follow the girl's line of sight and smiled. Ah, I see you're admiring a Western fife. I picked that one up in the tea country nearly 30 years ago. It has a wonderful sound, and is pretty durable providing that you clean it right. I wouldn't recommend it for someone like you, though. Tayuya glared slightly at the woman. Why not? Smiling softly at the redhead, she walked up to the wall and picked up a long, black flute with a deep red trim. Intricate red vines twisted up and around the flute in a spiral pattern, and small, dark red rose buds were painted at both ends. Tayuya felt her breath leave her as she reached out towards the flute. It's beautiful, isn't it? The construction is very similar to the Chinese bangdi, and the body itself is made up of a mixture of titanium alloy, aluminum, and a small amount of nickel. The sharpest kunai couldn't even scratch a flute of this caliber, let alone slice it in half. There's also a chakra-enhancing seal placed right inside of the blowing hole. Your genjutsu will be 10 times more devastating, and even an experienced shinobi would have a tough time getting out of a simple B-ranked illusion, if you're talented, of course. The girl ran her fingertips along the grooved surface of the flute, relishing in the feel of the cold metal against her skin. How much is it? She stuttered, afraid of what the answer would be. The owner sighed softly. Well, the original price is 65,440 yen. Both teens sucked in a large breath of air. That was a shitload of money, especially to two struggling genin. But, with the half-off sale, that brings the price down to 32,720 yen. Tayuya frowned again. It was way out of her price range, mostly because she was flat broke. She glanced over to Naruto, who had a similar sad grimace on his face. I don't have that much with me right now, he said, poking at his fatter-than-usual frog wallet. The woman sighed again and crossed her arms. How much do you have? The blonde shuffled through his money and let out a sigh of his own. Only about 17,000 yen. I'll tell you what. You show me that you actually have skill in playing the flute, and I'll cut the price in half again. It's not like I'll be able to sell all of these by the end of the month anyway, she said, motioning to the remaining flutes. The redhead's face lit up, and she smirked idly at the proposition. That's it, she snorted, hobbling over to a small stool leaning against the wall. You might as well start wrapping this shit up right now. After settling herself down on the wooden piece of furniture, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She hadn't so much as touched a flute since her battle with Shikamaru, and for a musician of her caliber, that was a longing time. Tayuya flexed her fingers and ran her tongue over her lips a few times before lifting the small black instrument to her lips. Blowing gently, she started off with a few scales to get used to the tone and timbre of the flute. For someone who'd only heard the sound of 3 different flutes in her entire lifetime, the small, metal woodwind produced the most beautiful sound her ears had ever had the pleasure of listening to. She nearly dropped the flute in surprise at the smooth, rich melody that emanated from the instrument, completely different from the wavering, haunting tone of her old flute. The older woman smiled knowingly. Beautiful, isn't it? She asked, a small twinkle in her eyes. Still shocked, Tayuya slowly nodded. Hell, I can't believe you're going to sell it to me for so cheap. I haven't agreed to anything yet, the owner said with a mischievous grin. In reality, she'd known the girl could play as soon as she walked into the store. The redhead had blown into the store with an excited, wide-eyed expression, and without even being shown, easily found her way to the southern wall of the shop as if she was being led by the instruments themselves. Instead of answering, Tayuya simply raised the flute to her lips and closed her eyes again. Surprisingly enough, she didn't know that many songs outside of the melodies she used to control her summoned ogres are genjutsu. Not because she didn't want to. No, between training with the Sound 5 and missions, she rarely had any time for herself. Taking a deep breath, she decided to play the first song she'd ever heard her grandmother play. The sound it made was simply astounding. Her fingers moved like liquid over the many individual air holes, and each note sounded as if the angels themselves were singing along in harmony with the flute. Standing to her right, Naruto could only watch amazed as she expertly manipulated the small instrument to do her bidding, increasing and decreasing her airflow with practiced ease. As he listened to her play, he realized that there was a whole lot more to the bitter girl he knew as Tayuya. Underneath her angry, abrasive mask was a completely different person, a girl who preferred to express herself through her music rather than her words. Adagio, the older woman whispered, jolting him from his trance-like state. In his days, He'd completely forgotten that she was still standing next to them. He lifted an eyebrow and glanced up at her. Adagio. She nodded slowly and smiled. By Ludwig van Beethoven, one of the greatest composers of all time. The fact that she can play the piece so well without any sort of reference, it's extraordinary. He stared at the woman a moment longer before turning his eyes back to his teammate. He didn't really understand all the stuff about music or composing, but he did know that what she was playing sure sounded good. A few minutes later, Tayuya finished the song and slowly brought the flute away from her still pursed lips. She kept her eyes closed for a couple of seconds, reveling in the rush she got from playing again after so long. Music was like a part of her soul, and without it, she didn't think that she would have lived as long as she did. It was the only thing in her life that she had complete control of, and it was often the thing that kept her sane when Orochimaru's demands became too much for her young mind and body to handle. She slowly opened her eyes to see both Naruto and the shop's owner staring at her with a mixture of surprise and awe. Immediately, she blushed and scowled back at them. What? She spat, furrowing her brows. The looks were unfamiliar, and to be honest, a little nerve-wracking. That was splendid, the woman gushed, clapping her hands together at a rapid pace. When I asked you to show me that you could play the flute, I was expecting something like Hot Cross Buns or Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, not something as advanced and intricate as Adagio. Most musicians that have been playing for over 15 years can't even play that piece, and you played it from memory. You have a true gift, do you know that? Tayuya's eyes softened at her words. She'd never been complimented so vehemently, and found that it wasn't all that bad of a feeling. Thank you, she murmured. The woman just shook her head and motioned for them to follow her to the front counter. Naruto waited until she was out of earshot before nervously scratching the back of his head and turning to his teammate. Anyo, I know this probably doesn't mean much coming from me, but you were really great. The redhead's blush deepened to an impossible shade of red. She quickly stood up and grabbed her crutches, hiding her burning face with her hair. On the inside, she was thoroughly disgusted with herself for showing so much emotion over something so trivial. She'd been trained for nearly 7 years to be a textbook ninja, and in less than 3 weeks, every rule and regulation she'd learned had been unceremoniously thrown out the window. All because of a loudmouthed, orange-wearing genin. Instead of acknowledging his praise, she snorted and made her way to the front of the store. Hurry up, she snapped, glancing over her shoulder at him. Naruto stuck his tongue out at her but followed anyway. He'd already seen some of what was under her mask, and was already plotting to uncover the rest. When they reached the front counter, the owner smiled and set a small case in front of them. 16,362 yen, please, she said, looking at the blonde expectantly. Sighing slightly, he slowly pulled Gamma-chan from his pocket to procure the money from the frog's open mouth, and Tayuya swore she saw a small tear roll down the now skinny frog's cheek. The woman quickly counted the money and placed it in the register. She then pulled 2 medium-sized paperback books from the shelf behind her and placed them next to the flute's case. I know they probably won't be of much use to someone as skilled as yourself, but since I need to get rid of most of this stuff soon anyway, I'll give these to you for free. The redhead blinked in surprise and looked down to read the titles. In big, bold black letters, the first book read Flutes, Songs, and Melodies. Curious, she flipped through the book to see nearly 200 pages filled with sheet music, and even a blank section in the back to compose some of her own. The second book was a bit smaller than the first and read Theory and Composition of Musical Genjutsu. She looked up at the smiling woman in shock. I can't accept these, she exclaimed, nearly recoiling at the thought. Don't be silly. Like I said before, it's pretty rare that someone comes here to buy a battle flute, and even rarer that they want to buy a book that supplements them. All I ask in return is that you continue to play and improve. Is it a deal? Tayuya slowly nodded and grasped the books in her hands, still in a small state of disbelief that she was getting them for free. She handed them over to an equally surprised Naruto and placed the flute in its case. After locking the latch in place and picking it up in her right hand, she bowed to the woman one last time. "Arigato," she said, doing her best to sound as sincere as humanly possible. The owner waved her off with another smile. "When you've composed a song of your own, I'd love to hear it. As a matter of fact, here." She quickly scribbled something on a slip of paper and handed it to Tayuya. "It's my address. Come by anytime. I'll probably be home a lot once this store closes for good." The owner then turned her eyes over to Naruto. "And you?" she started, narrowing her eyes slightly. The boy gulped in fear. He knew she was being too nice to be true. "Why, yeah, make sure she stays on top of her practice. I would hate to see such pure talent go to waste." Naruto hesitantly lifted his hand to his head in a military salute. "Hi." They waved one last time to the kindly old woman before walking out of the disorganized old store. As soon as they were outside, the blonde shot his teammate an amused glance. "I didn't know you even had manners," he chuckled, not noticing her narrowing eyes. She smacked him upside the head with one of her crutches in response. Still, she couldn't find it in herself to stay mad at him and allowed a small smirk to play across her lips. "Idiot. She just sold me the best flute I've ever laid eyes on for cheap. Of course I'm gonna use some manners." She lowered the crutch to the ground and began to set off towards the training grounds at a casual pace. "Where are we going now?" Tayuya paused long enough to glare at him from over her shoulder. "I'm going to play my new flute. You can do whatever you want." Naruto watched her hobble away from him with a frown on his face. He'd been hoping to get a bowl or 5 of ramen with his remaining money, but he knew perfectly well that he couldn't let her out of his sight unsupervised. There was still a chance that one of Orochimaru's men was hidden inside the village's walls, and since she wasn't quite healed yet, it'd be too dangerous for her to try to protect herself. Sighing softly, he quickly jogged to her side and fell into step beside her. They arrived at Training Ground 3 in just under half an hour. It was deserted except for the usual squirrels and birds, and Tayuya wasted no time in finding a large tree to recline against. She carefully lowered herself to the ground and pulled her flute from its case. "What are you gonna play?" Naruto asked, plopping down beside her. He almost chuckled when he realized that it was the same exact tree he'd hung from during Kakashi's genin exam. Out of all the trees in the forested area, she just happened to pick this one. She shrugged slightly and flipped through the new songbook she'd received earlier. "This looks good." He glanced down at the page and scrunched his nose. To him, the whole arrangement looked like a bunch of random scribbles and lines. His eyes traveled to the top of the page and read over the title. "Claire de Lune." She nodded and lifted the flute to her lips. Blowing gently, she began to play, focusing diligently on the book in her lap. The tune was slow and sleepy, nothing like the haunting songs she already knew. The redhead felt the corners of her mouth twitch upwards when she spared a glance towards the blonde reclining beside her. As he listened to her play, Naruto noticed that his eyelids were becoming heavier by the second. He was doing his best to stay awake and on guard, but Tayuya's melody was making his task increasingly difficult. "I'll just close my eyes for a few seconds," he thought, sliding further down on the rough bark of the tree. In seconds, he was asleep. The girl watched amused as he snored softly at her side. She wasn't even halfway done with the song, and he was already asleep. Of course, it wasn't completely his fault. The song was designed to be a lullaby, and the fact that he was out cold proved that she was doing a decent job in playing it. She tore her eyes away from his sleeping face and smiled. At least now she could practice in peace. If there was one good thing that anyone could say about her, it was that she was diligent and aggressive in her training. For the first time in nearly 3 weeks, Hyuga Neji smiled. Today, he was going to be released from the hospital and would be allowed to resume training in a week's time. As the nurse wheeled him out of the small, drab room, he anxiously awaited to see who would pick him up to take him home. In the worst-case scenario, it would be Guy and Lee. Luckily, however, Guy had come by the day before and informed him that he'd be away on an A-ranked mission for a week. Although it was a morbid thought, he was almost glad that the Leaf needed extra help from the Junin senseis to get back on their feet. That left the Hyuga household and his other teammates, Tenten and Lee. Any of the above choices would suit him just fine, although he really wouldn't like to see his cousins for a while. The nurse rounded the corner and smiled. Here we are. Neji looked up to meet the smiling face of his teammate, Tenten. He let loose a small breath of relief. She was the most tolerable out of his team and of his family. Hello, Neji-kun, she gushed, walking up to them. His brows furrowed slightly at her overly fangirlish attitude. Tenten usually wasn't like other girls. For the most part, she tended to stay calm and neutral in all situations. Unless she was meeting with her idol, the Godime Hokage, of course. Still, he put on one of the famous Hyuga smirks as she approached. Tenten, he said, acknowledging her greeting. The nurse stepped aside and allowed the brown-haired girl to grab the handlebars of the wheelchair. Remember, no training for at least a week. The wound in your abdomen still hasn't fully recovered, so Hokage-sama strictly forbids any kind of taijutsu. Training involving chakra should be alright, but take it easy regardless. He nodded as she walked back into the hospital, leaving the genin alone in the lobby of the building. So, Neji-kun, how was your stay? Tenten asked, wheeling him out of the sliding double doors. The Hyuga grunted angrily. Terrible. I was interrupted daily by nurses and visitors, fed the worst grovel I've ever tasted, and… Tenten, where are we going? The Hyuga mansion is in the other direction. He glanced up at her to see a positively bone-chilling smile on her face. It wasn't her usual soft, caring smile. No, this one was much more sinister in nature, and for a moment, he thought he saw her eyes flash a demonic blood red. We're going to train, Neji-kun. A small bit of panic welled up inside of his chest. There was something strange about the way she'd said that sentence. But, the nurse just said, Neji-kun, she snapped, cutting him off. All traces of happiness and playfulness were gone. She stopped pushing for a moment to collect her thoughts. Do you know what I did yesterday afternoon? She asked, her voice completely serious. Too surprised at her sudden change in personality to speak, he simply shook his head. Well, I got a little visit from your cousin Hanabi. He seriously considered making a break for the Hyuga compound, but knowing his current condition, she would catch up to him easily. If he was going to live, he'd have to be smart. Really? What did she want? Tenten placed her hands on his shoulders and dropped her head, building a slow chuckle in the back of her throat. Oh, Neji-kun, who are you trying to fool? I know you sent her to me. Hanabi told me herself. Neji swallowed noisily and desperately began looking for an escape route. No amount of talking could get him out of this one. Now, Neji-kun, why would you send your 8-year-old cousin to ask me about masturbation? Her tone of voice promised death, and if it weren't for his royal upbringing, he was sure that he would have pissed his pants by now. I thought you'd know better than I would. He asked, edging towards the end of his seat. She chuckled again and shook her head. Neji. Do you know how awkward it is to teach a straight-laced, stuck-up, you innocent girl what it means to masturbate? To answer every embering, gut-wrenching, disturbing question without sounding like a complete brothel girl. She was messing with him now, but judging by his tensing muscles and wide eyes, he hadn't realized it. At that moment, Neji shot up from his wheelchair and made a mad dash in the opposite direction. His legs were a blur as he sped down the street, and a glance over his shoulder showed a surprised and pissed off Tenten still gripping the handlebars of his wheelchair. He allowed himself a small smile as he turned his eyes forward, only to meet the glaring eyes of the girl he'd just left behind. The smile instantly dropped from his face as he skid to a hasty stop. But you, how? She placed her hands on his shoulders and turned him around. Instantly, the girl standing by the chair dissipated into nothing. Bunshin no Jutsu, E-level Genjutsu. Now, she chirped, grabbing him by the back of his collar. How are you going to make it up to me? He lowered his head in defeat. In his current condition, there was nothing he could do to fight off her advances, and his only chance for survival was to go along with her demands and hope for the best. Whatever you want. Tenten smiled deviously as she dragged him along the ground on his back. That's what I wanted to hear. First, you're going to help me train. I just learned a new B-ranked weapons jutsu last week, and need someone to test it out on. Don't worry, I'll try not to kill you. Then, I want you to take me out to dinner. A new restaurant just opened in the market district, and, as she droned on in her demands, Neji couldn't help but wonder what the hell he did to deserve such a fate. Maybe it was the fact that he used to be an all-around hole to any and everyone. Maybe it was because he'd tried to kill his own flesh and blood during the Chunin exams. Whatever it was, karma was rearing its ugly head at this moment in time, and he did the only thing one could in this situation. Raising a stiff middle finger towards the sky, Neji glared at the clouds and mouthed 2 words towards the heavens. Single quote. You, Naruto. Oi, bastard, get up. Naruto squeezed his eyes together and rolled over, a bit of drool seeping from the edge of his mouth. Tayuya was currently doing her best to wake him up without having to resort to violence. Unfortunately for him, she had a very short patience, and she picked up the larger of the 2 books and smacked him on the head with it. Ouch! He yelped, sitting up and rubbing his head. He glared tiredly at the smirking redhead before letting out a wide yawn. You sleep like a goddamn rock. Aren't shinobi supposed to be alert at all times? The blonde brushed off her question and retaliated with one of his own. Why'd you wake me up? Tayuya rolled her eyes and pointed towards the sky. The sun was just starting to disappear behind the horizon, and the sky was illuminated with countless hues of orange, purple, and red. The clouds were also turned a vibrant shade of peach, completing the perfect mosaic painted by the sky. It's too dark, and I can't read my book anymore. Naruto tilted his head in confusion. And I want to go home. I haven't had a decent shower in weeks, and I feel like shit. Let's go, she urged, pulling on his arm to emphasize her command. The blonde rolled his eyes and stood up. Hi, geez, you're so bossy. He reached out a hand to help her up, but she instead handed him her books and used the tree to get up by herself. When she was situated on her crutches, they set off towards the inner city at a leisurely pace. Except for a few stragglers, the streets of Konoha were mostly devoid of life. Many of the citizens were still struggling with the memory of the attack by the sand and sound, and often shut themselves in by sundown. Even the builders and repairmen had called it quits for the day, leaving unfinished buildings and supplies strewn about the edges of the road. Not that they minded. For her part, Tayuya was becoming quite sick of being jeered at by the lowly civilians. Hell, back in Orochimaru's village, that was a one-way ticket to the morgue, if she left enough of the victim, that is. But, since Naruto seemed to ignore it, she endured it as best she could. They'd be leaving in 2 days anyway, and there was no sense in doing something that could threaten her chances of avoiding death or imprisonment. She glanced over at the boy in question to see that he was becoming increasingly nervous as they neared the residential district. What's up? She asked, giving him a slightly concerned glare. Based on what she'd seen in the last 3 weeks, he never let anything get to him, much to her annoyance of course. Her glare turned into a small mischievous grin. Since he seemed to be a little more vulnerable at the moment, now was a great time to pump him for information. Are you nervous about what your parents will say when you bring me home? His shoulders tensed for a split second, and if she wasn't a trained kunoichi, she easily would have missed it. I don't have parents. Tayuya shrugged nonchalantly. She'd kind of figured that, but didn't want to be caught off guard after she walked through the front door of his house. Still, she wasn't quite satisfied with his answer. Doing her best to sound as casual as possible, she prodded a bit further into his life. Oh, you know who they were? Nope. She raised an eyebrow in surprise. So you've been an orphan since birth? Without even looking at her, he nodded. She found herself frowning more and more with each of his replies. Well, who the raised you then? No one. Tayuya nearly slipped off of her crutches. He'd had no one. She shook her head in disbelief. Something just wasn't adding up. This unfathomable, perpetually cheerful ball of sunshine raised himself. Exclamation mark. It was incredibly hard to believe that he was able to survive such open hostility and persecution without anyone to back him up. If she'd had the Kyuubi inside of her, she would have used the bastard's power to go Super Saiyan on their S years ago. Snorting softly, she realized that she had a whole new level of respect for the boy, even if it was grudging. They walked along in a slightly awkward silence for a few minutes until Naruto stopped and pointed to their left. That's where I live. If you don't want to stay here, it's okay. I'm sure Ba-chan has an extra room in that huge Hokage mansion she's got. The redhead tilted her head slightly and studied the wide building with a critical eye. She couldn't see it as well in the darkening light, but so far, it didn't look too bad. The light yellow walls of the three-story building were slightly dirty, and there were countless shingles missing from the orange-red roof. Pipes and wires ran all around the exterior of the apartment, winding into and out of different windows and openings, and it seemed as though someone had done a half-ed job of repairing a few of the concrete walls with large planks of green wood. From the outside, it was very livable. You got water and electricity? She asked, still staring at the building. Naruto blinked in surprise. Yeah, but that's good enough for me. Tayuya quickly crossed the street and made her way to the first flight of stairs. She frowned up at them until she felt herself being lifted into the air from below. What the air you doing? The genin spat. While she was busy trying to figure out how she would get up the stairs, Naruto had ducked between her legs and lifted her up on his shoulders, crutches and all. What? I'm not gonna wait an hour for you to crawl up the stairs, he said as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. She hit him lightly on the top of the head with the end of her crutch and pouted. I'm not gonna thank you. The blonde shrugged as best he could with a girl on his shoulders. You don't have to. Since she really wasn't that heavy, it took him just under 2 minutes to scale both sets of stairs and arrive in front of his door. He crouched down enough for her to get off and reached into his pocket for the key. Ah, just so you know, it's kinda messy. She almost laughed at the nervous expression on his face. Are you being serious? I slept in the same room with 3 other guys for 7 years of my life, and one of them was the fattest motherer in our village. Hell, you couldn't walk into our shit without stepping on a Twinkie wrapper or a half-eaten bowl of Cocoa Puffs. Naruto nearly choked on his spit as he cackled at the mental image her words were producing. Watching him fight for a breath of air, she allowed a small giggle of her own to escape from her normally scowling lips. When he recovered enough to stand up straight again, he stuck the key into the keyhole and twisted it in a clockwise direction. He then swung the door open wide and motioned for her to walk in ahead of him, to which she amusedly obliged. Tayuya stepped into the small apartment and slipped out of her ninja sandals. She couldn't see anything from the hallway, so she slowly hobbled a little further until she came to a large door on her right. That's my room, he said, appearing behind her. Nodding, she opened the door and flipped on the light. Immediately, Her eyes were met with the sight of dozens of scrolls, books, and wadded up pieces of paper on his bed and on the ground. A few ramen cups sat on the floor, and it was painfully obvious that he hadn't done any cleaning in at least a week. She smirked at him from over her shoulder. I didn't know you studied, she teased, causing him to scratch the back of his head sheepishly. Yeah, well, I was just reading up on seals and stuff. Ero Sennin said if I learned the basics, he'd teach me how to do the cool stuff later. It's kinda hard, though. The redhead glanced back at the scrolls and frowned. Seals, huh, she thought, scratching her head slightly. She'd learned how to seal small things like weapons and clothing from Orochimaru, but anything larger than a meter was out of the question. She briefly considered teaching him how to do it but decided to take a look at the rest of the apartment first. Tayuya turned around and limped the rest of the way down the hall until she came to another door. What's in here? Naruto walked up to her side and opened the door. This is the bathroom. It's not that dirty, I don't think. She turned on the light and smiled. While it certainly wasn't the cleanest bathroom in the world, it was definitely better than what she was used to. She turned around and walked towards the final opening at the end of the hall. This room was easily the biggest in the entire house, being both the kitchen and the living room. A small stove and refrigerator sat in the corner closest to them, and a small table with a large basket on top was set up right in the middle. Numerous plants sat on a shelf next to the icebox, causing her to raise an eyebrow at the genin following behind her. Gardening? She asked, motioning towards the pots with one of her crutches. He crossed his arms across his chest defensively and shrugged. Shaking her head, she turned back to finish her investigation of the room. There wasn't much left. A couch sat against the opposite corner of the wall, and a small TV rested on a black apple crate. Not bad. I don't mind crashing here for a couple of days. A nervous grin appeared on his face, suddenly making her suspicious. What? You don't want me to stay? No, it's just that you're gonna be the first person to stay over at my house. Both of her eyebrows shot up into her hairline. Really? What about the faggot Uchiha and that pineapple-headed sucker? Aren't they your friends? He frowned slightly and nodded. Well, yeah, but they've never slept over or anything. Anyway, make yourself at home. You can use anything you want. She let loose a small sigh of relief and wasted no time in heading back down the hallway. Good. I've been waiting for this shit since last month. Instead of going straight to the bathroom, she hobbled her way into Naruto's bedroom for a change of clothes. While her clothes weren't especially dirty, she really didn't want to sleep in something she'd worn all day, and she would probably have to wear those clothes tomorrow too. She opened the top drawer of his dresser and pulled out a pair of orange boxer shorts. She then bent down to sift through the rest of his drawers until she emerged with a simple black t-shirt. Satisfied, she made a beeline towards the shower. After closing and locking the door behind her, she reached into the shower stall and turned the water on to let it get warm. When it reached the appropriate temperature, she stripped down to her birthday suit and slowly slid under the soothing beads of water. Immediately, she felt better than she had in a while and let out a loud content sigh. As the water cascaded over her smooth, lightly tanned skin, she felt every annoyance, worry, and exasperation wash away along with the dirt and grime from the day's activities. Damn, she breathed, reveling in the feeling of the lukewarm water on her face. Deciding she'd enjoyed herself enough, she reached for the bar of soap sitting in the dish next to her and lathered her body with the small, fragrant oval. Stepping back from the water, she grabbed some of Naruto's shampoo and began to massage it into her scalp and hair, frowning at the length. Apparently, it hadn't receded when she was knocked out of her curse seal state. She made a mental note to get a haircut sometime within the next month. Suitably clean, she stepped back under the water and proceeded to wash the suds off of her body and hair before turning off the soothing jets of water and carefully stepping out of the shower. Her legs felt a little better than they had earlier, and if she moved slowly enough, she could actually walk without the crutches. Tayuya grabbed a towel from the nearby rack and roughly attacked her hair, drying it as best she could with her own power. She then used the towel to wipe the fog from the mirror and peered curiously into the reflective GL. Her eyes widened to the size of dinner plates and her mouth dropped open as she looked at her reflection. The changes weren't huge. For the most part she looked exactly the same, and unless the person spent a load of time with her on a daily basis, they probably wouldn't notice. The first thing she noticed was that her hair was slightly thicker than she remembered it. Only a few days before it was limp and flat, reaching towards the ground in a very lackluster manner. Now, however, it hung from her head in shining waves of rose red, framing her face and drawing more attention to her eyes. That train of thought brought her to her next observation. Instead of the plain dark brown they were before, her irises were lightly dusted with red, making them appear much lighter than they'd been before. The girl also discovered that her eyes were slightly more angular in appearance, giving her an older and more mature look to go along with her hair. She smiled at the thought, causing her eyes to immediately focus on her mouth. Or, more specifically, her teeth. She nearly gasped at the length and sharpness of her incisors, tonguing them lightly to prove to herself that they were real. They were one step away from looking like actual fangs, and as she observed them further, she found that she looked eerily similar to the members of the Inuzuka clan Orochimaru had forced her to read about. Smirking slightly, she growled playfully into the mirror, baring her teeth and narrowing her eyes for added effect. To her amusement, she looked pretty damn intimidating and hot with that feral expression on her face. Tayuya pulled her eyes downward to study the rest of her body. Not much had changed in her overall composition. She looked to be about the same height, although her muscles seemed a little more defined than they had been a few days before. Poking at her stomach, she realized that it was a bit flatter, too. Weird, she thought, lightly drumming on her tummy. As if on autopilot, her hands reached up to poke at her. While no could have ever called her flat-chested, like a certain pink-haired kunoichi, she certainly didn't remember them being this big. They'd never filled her hands like this before, although to be fair, she didn't have a lot of free time to look herself over every single week. Bracing her hands against the sink, she lightly bounced up and down, delighting in the slight bounce of her chest when she stopped. She almost brought her hands up to touch them again, but forcefully pulled them back down to her sides. If she didn't hurry up and get dressed, Naruto would start to worry. And the last time he'd worried, a light blush adorned her cheeks at the thought of the blonde peeking in on her while she studied the subtle changes of her body. The door was locked, but then again, he was a shinobi, albeit a dense one. Quickly shaking off that thought, she grabbed her change of clothes off of the toilet seat and hurriedly got dressed, taking special care not to put too much pressure on her legs while she did so. The boxers were a little shorter than she would have liked, only reaching to about the middle of her thigh, but they weren't much smaller than the tight training shorts she wore on a regular basis. Taking one last glance at herself in the mirror, she grabbed the crutches leaning against the wall and slowly walked out into the living room. Naruto was currently sitting on his couch, focusing intently on a large scroll perched comfortably in his lap. Judging by his expression, she could see that he was having some trouble understanding it. His brows were furrowed in hopeless concentration, and his hands were digging viciously into the weathered paper of the document. Deciding to make her presence known, it was never a good idea to sneak up on a shinobi. No matter how incompetent they were, she loudly cleared her throat to get his attention. "I used your clothes," she said, moving towards the kitchen area of the apartment. "You can take your shower now if you want." The blonde nodded slowly and rolled up the scroll. His eyes were beginning to hurt from reading so much at once, and Tayuya's suggestion was a much welcomed interruption. She watched bemused as he dragged his weary body from the couch and languidly trotted down the hallway. When he disappeared into the small, steamy bathroom, the redhead set about her task of finding something to eat. The first place she checked was the refrigerator. Unfortunately, it was pathetically empty save for an expired carton of milk, 4 or 5 eggs, and half a jug of apple juice. She checked the cupboards one by one, finding things like unused pots, pans, plates, and just about every utensil known to man, but no food. Just as she was about to give up and yell at Naruto for being a poor son of a bitch, a large box sitting next to the stove caught her eye. Or rather, it was the word written on it that got her attention. In big, black permanent marker was the word ramen. Of course, she mumbled, opening the box and peering inside. The brown cube was literally packed with different flavors of cup ramen, apparently color-coded and alphabetized by flavor. Grabbing a dozen cups from the bin, she simultaneously pulled a large pot from the cupboard and filled it with water. Heating up the cups one by one would take far too long using a kettle, and in her opinion, it was a whole lot easier to just cook them all in one batch. With that thought in mind, she set the pot onto the stove and turned it up to high. The girl then reached into the cupboard for a couple of bowls and slowly ambled over to the table. Just as she was about to set the bowls down in their places, she noticed the small basket sitting right in the middle of the tiny folding table. How the did I miss that? She wondered, removing the excessive amount of plastic from around the edges. Her eyes widened when she saw what was inside, a whole variety of different fruits and vegetables, ranging from apples and bananas to potatoes and zucchini. She plucked a small piece of paper resting boastfully on top of the ornament and looked it over, rolling her eyes at its contents. Naruto, you eat too much ramen. If you want to be a good ninja, eat your fruits and veggies. She said, reading the message aloud. Well, she couldn't argue with that. Whoever had left the basket didn't sign a name, only a small chibi picture of some faggot with one eye. Shrugging, she grabbed a few mushrooms, carrots, and an onion to add to the soup. Once the water started boiling, she quickly opened all 12 of the cups and dumped them in one by one. She then chopped the vegetables she'd found a few minutes earlier and threw them in on top. Using one of his brand new spoons, she stirred the mixture until everything was boiling evenly. Let's see, she muttered to herself. She opened the icebox again and grabbed the remaining eggs, breaking one to see if it had gone bad. To her relief, they seemed rather fresh, and she wasted no time in breaking the rest of them and tossing their innards into the boiling pot of soup. At that moment, a certain blonde ninja wafted into the kitchen, creeping up beside her and peering into the pot. "Whatcha cookin'?" he asked, squinting to see what was inside. Tayuya snorted slightly and stirred the contents again. Ramen. It was the only shit left in this entire house, and you should be grateful that I'm making some for you, too. Naruto lifted an eyebrow in surprise. You're cooking some for me? Why? She shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly. I might be a bitch, but I'm not an unappreciative one. You've done a lot of shit for me these past 3 weeks, and if all I have to do is cook some ramen to pay you back, then, I'm all for it. He laughed softly at her answer, causing a small smirk to appear on her own face. They stood there for a few more minutes, both staring impatiently at the boiling noodles rushing around in the large black pot. Realizing their close proximity, the redhead quickly turned the burner off and stepped away from the stove. I think it's done now. Why don't you bring it to the table? She stuttered, grabbing the apple juice and some cups before heading towards the dining area. The blonde nodded and grabbed the pot by its handles. He moved the basket and set it down right between them. Neither of them wasted any time in digging into the large amount of ramen, pouring copious amounts of the soup into their bowls. Tayuya hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days, so for the first 5 servings, she was easily keeping up with the self-proclaimed ramen king. By the time she reached her 7th, the pot was already empty and both were contentedly leaning back in their chairs. That was great, Naruto sighed, stretching his arms languidly into the air. The girl nodded her agreement and lazily poked at her bowl with her chopsticks. After a few more minutes of relaxing, she placed her hands on the table and forcibly pushed herself up into a standing position. I'm tired. Where do I sleep? She asked, grabbing her bowl and cup from the table. Her teammate stretched one more time and grabbed the remaining dishes off of the tiny card table. You can have my bed. Ba-chan said you need to recover, and you won't be comfortable on the floor. She nodded again as she hobbled towards the kitchen. The sooner she could walk, the better. She placed her dish in the sink and walked towards Naruto's bedroom. Night. Naruto called from the living room. Tayuya froze mid-step and looked over her shoulder at the blonde, briefly taking notice of his silly-looking nightcap. You're not sleeping in your room. When he shot her a confused glance, she quickly rushed to explain herself. Because, it's your room, and I'd feel bad if you had to sleep on the couch. Naruto shrugged and continued to fix up the chair. It's no big deal. I can sleep on it for a couple of nights. Oh, well, I heard somewhere that sleeping on the floor is good for your back sometimes. Works out all the kinks and shit. She was bullshitting now, but knowing his gullible nature, he'd probably buy it. A smirk flittered onto her face when he appeared to be thinking it over. It was almost too easy. Really? That does sound right. Thanks. He moved his sheets from the couch to the floor in front of it, earning a groan from the disabled girl in front of him. Goddamn it, Naruto, if you're gonna sleep on the ing floor, then you might as well sleep on the ing floor in your own goddamn room. He raised his eyebrows in surprise. You don't mind. Tayuya shook her head and let loose an exasperated sigh. He was dense. No, Naruto, I don't mind. Come on. He grabbed his things and followed her into the large room. It took a few minutes to clean up all the paper and trash littered on the floor, but eventually he was able to spread his sleeping bag next to the bed. Yawning, he plopped back onto the makeshift bed and placed his hands behind his head. Nay, Tayuya? He asked, still looking up at the ceiling. She was currently sitting on his bed, stretching her legs as much as she was able to in her current condition. She paused momentarily to look at him. What? Well, why did you want me to sleep in here? I know I'm not the smartest guy around, but I'm not stupid either. Tayuya's face unnoticeably flushed in surprise. She was certain that she'd gotten away with it, and slowly leaned back until she was in a position mirroring the boy's own. Don't feel special or anything, I've just never really slept alone before. In the sound, there was always at least one of the ers in the room with me. I'm not used to being by myself yet. Why didn't you just say that? The redhead frowned, glaring at him as if it was obvious. Because it's embering. What kind of third-rate shinobi is scared of sleeping by themselves? She watched him close eyes and turn over onto his side, facing the wall away from her. I think that since you were brave enough to admit it, you're stronger than anyone. She felt her cheeks grow warm at the compliment, and lay back on Naruto's bed in silence. She could see why he was called Konoha's #1 surprising ninja. Who would have guessed that the hyperactive blonde idiot actually had a brain? Smirking amusedly to herself, she pulled the sheets over her tired form and closed her eyes. Night, Naruto, she murmured, already feeling her consciousness slipping. Unbeknownst to her, Naruto was smiling happily in his makeshift bed on the floor. For the first time in 13 years, he had someone to say goodnight to, other than his photo of Team 7, anyway. Night, Tayuya. With that, both teens drifted into a peaceful slumber, dreaming of the past, present, and the future. Tayuya awoke to the annoyingly chipper sound of bluebirds singing at her window. Rubbing the sleep out of her eyes, she pulled out the kunai she'd stashed under her pillow. No shinobi in their right mind would sleep unprotected, and nonchalantly tossed it towards the window, piercing one of the birds directly through its heart and scattering the others. Birds, she mumbled, holding back a yawn. She glanced down to the floor to see that Naruto had already left, and turned her gaze to the clock beside her to look at the time. 10:30. Damn. She quickly flung her legs over the edge of the bed and stood up. Her legs felt much better than they had the day before. In fact, she could probably go without her crutches. Smiling, she stretched and took a few practice steps towards the door. For the most part, her legs felt sturdy. Still, the small shakiness worried her, so she grabbed one of the crutches leaning against the foot of the bed just in case. Leaning lightly on the small wooden support, she slowly exited the room to look for her blonde teammate. As soon as she stepped through the door, the sound of exaggerated explosions and shouts reached her ears. She rounded the corner of the hallway to see Naruto sitting cross-legged on the ground, alternating between reading through a scroll and looking at the small television. He was dressed in his regular orange pants, a black t-shirt, and a black headband with the word, "Guts," sewn onto the front. Noticing her presence, he looked up with a sheepish smile. "The TV didn't wake you up, did it?" he asked, scratching the back of his head in emberment. Tayuya smiled back and shook her head. "No, but I kinda wish it would've. Why the hell'd you let me sleep so late?" The blonde shrugged his shoulders and turned back to his scroll. "Ba-chan said you needed to rest, so I thought a few extra hours would help you get better faster. How are your legs?" The redhead lifted her eyebrows in surprise at his foresight. Now that she thought about it, it did make some sense. "They're okay. It feels like I just ran non-stop from Odo to Konoha, though." "What the hell is that?" she asked, pointing to the scroll resting tightly between his fingers. He turned it towards her enough so that she could glance over it. "You're still reading that shit. Sealing isn't that tough." Naruto lowered the paper and stared up at her with something akin to shock. "You know how to seal." When she nodded, he pushed the rest of his books out of the way and patted the ground next to him. "Show me how to do it. Please." Tayuya rolled her eyes but walked over to his side anyway. Using the crutch as a support, she lowered herself to the ground and plopped down next to him, crossing her legs to match his position. "First, you have to tell me what you know. Do you know how sealing works?" He furrowed his brows and made a basic thinking pose. You put stuff into a scroll and roll it up." The blonde questioned, glancing at her with a confused expression. She regarded him with a deadpan expression and sighed. This was going to be much harder than she thought. "No, dipshit. It's much more complicated than that. Look, it'll be better if I show you. You got some ink and paper?" Naruto nodded and quickly hopped to his feet, rushing to his room at a dead sprint. He returned a few seconds later with a small bottle of ink, a brush, and a stack of blank paper. "Here you go." To her amusement, the bottle was still sealed at the top. Apparently, he didn't do much writing. She easily snapped open the seal and twisted the top off of the small bottle. "Okay, first you need to know exactly what it is that you want to seal." The blonde reached into the weapons pouch at his side and picked out a single kunai. Plucking it from his fingers, she set it down directly in front of a small piece of paper. She then dipped the end of the unused brush carefully into the ink and stirred the viscous fluid around to get it moving. Sealing is easy. You're basically telling the paper what it is that you want to seal, or what action you want it to perform when activated. I usually write what the item is too, so that I don't forget what it was that I sealed. There's nothing worse than pulling out the wrong weapon and getting your kicked because of it. Lifting the ink-covered tool from the bottle, she wrote the kanji for "unseal kunai" at the top of the paper. "That's all there is to it," he yelled, jaw figuratively scraping against the ground. Tayuya bopped him on top of the head with her free hand. "Of course not, idiot. I still have to put the kunai into the scroll." She closed her eyes to calm herself down enough to continue with the lesson. For some reason, he was able to annoy her without even trying. "Now that you've got the words down, you have to convert the item into chakra using your own, and place it into the kanji you wrote before. She picked up the knife and channeled a bit of chakra into it before pressing it down firmly onto the freshly painted symbols. Automatically, the symbols began to glow as the kunai disappeared into the piece of paper, and a circular ring appeared around the area. That ring means that the item has successfully been sealed. I've seen some people draw the ring themselves first and put the item inside of it, but I'm not sure how or why that works. You'd have to ask someone who knows a lot more about this shit than I do. Whoa, that's awesome. Naruto watched amazed as she finished the sealing, already itching to try it for himself. How do you get it back out? Tayuya smirked and placed a hand onto the paper. Easy. Just channel a little bit of your chakra into the paper and focus on the location of what you want to pull out. This is the most important part, as you usually have a lot more weapons in one scroll than a single kunai. Her fingertips glowed a light blue, and almost instantly, the knife popped back up from the paper, removing the kanji and circle along with it. She spun it around on her finger by the loop a few times before tossing it to him with an smug grin. Your turn. Naruto wasted no time in grabbing the kunai out of mid-air and placing it on the floor in front of him. He then haphazardly wrote, "Unseal kunai," on the piece of paper she'd just finished using and began to channel a bunch of chakra into the weapon. Unfortunately, the weapon refused to sink into the paper like Tayuya had done only a minute ago, and he let loose a frustrated sigh. It's not working. He groaned, crossing his arms with a childlike pout. The redhead snatched the kunai from his hand with a glare, holding it at eye level with experienced fingers. Dumb, weren't you paying attention? I didn't pump every ounce of my chakra reserves into the kunai. The idea is to surround the item in a thin veil of chakra and maintain it, not shoot a huge blast into it all at once. His eyes widened in understanding, and he plucked the knife from her fingers to try again. At first, nothing happened. Gradually, however, a growing sheet of chakra began to expand and grow over the kunai, enveloping it in a light blue haze. Like this? He asked. She leaned closer to study the weapon before slowly nodding her head, surprised that he had the chakra control to pull it off. That looks about right. Try to seal it into the paper. Nodding, the genin carefully placed it over the kanji. To his obvious relief, it immediately began to sink into the paper until a circle similar to Tayuya's appeared around the kanji. It worked. Naruto's grin threatened to split his face in half as he hopped to his feet and held the paper up into the air, abundantly proud of his achievement. Tayuya put on a tiny smirk of her own at his antics, but quickly covered it up with a frown. Not yet, it hasn't. You still haven't pulled it back out. The blonde stopped in the middle of his celebrating and matched her frown with one of his own. Oh, yeah. He plopped down onto the floor and channeled some chakra into his hand. Being careful to keep his chakra output to a minimum, he gently placed his fingers onto the piece of paper. A small cloud of smoke popped up from the card, revealing the kunai he'd sealed a few seconds before. You did it. The girl cheered, clapping him softly on the back. Naruto timidly scratched the area directly below his nose and beamed. Only because you told me how. You're a way better teacher than these stupid scrolls. Tayuya blushed prettily at the compliment. It felt good to be useful to someone, even if it was for something as simple as sealing a kunai. Hell, in the end, she hadn't even been useful to Orochimaru or the rest of her teammates. Not that she cared too much about their deaths, since each and every one of them had been an all-around whole to her for the past 7 years. While lost in her thoughts, she failed to notice that the blonde had leaned forward onto his hands to stare curiously into her eyes. What's wrong with your face? Are you sick? He asked, barely 4 inches away from her face. Recoiling in shock, she opened and closed her mouth a few times in surprise, looking very much like a fish out of water. How the hell had she allowed him to get so close without her realizing it? It was unusual to have someone invading her personal space so audaciously, and thinking quickly, she grabbed her crutch and used it to push herself up onto her feet. What the hell are you talking about? I'm just hungry. She walked towards the kitchen as fast as she could on her weakened legs and immediately set about heating up the tea kettle, leaving a very bewildered Naruto in her wake. He slowly stood up and followed her into the kitchen area. That's weird. My face doesn't turn red when I'm hungry. Are you sure you're not sick? While he spoke, he gently placed his palm against her forehead. You are sick. Tayuya's face reached a whole new level of redness. Not only was he nearly flush against her body, but he was touching her. The uneasy feeling in the bottom of her stomach was starting to make her physically sick, and using as much strength as she could muster, she roughly pushed him away from her. I'm fine. Don't touch me, she stuttered, cursing herself for being so feeble. Just get the away from me. The blonde blinked in confusion and took a cautious step towards her. Tayuya. Wah. I said go away. An awkward silence settled over the room, the only sound being the quiet bubbling of the water in the teapot. Naruto lowered his head in dejection and stared sadly at the overwrought form of his teammate. He didn't understand what he'd done. 1 minute they'd been smiling and laughing, and the next she was yelling at him. His frown deepened when he realized that she hadn't yelled at him with such an afraid expression on her face since their encounter with the sound nin. With a heavy sigh, he reluctantly turned to walk back to the other side of the room. Standing in front of the stove, Tayuya felt her eyes burning with unshed tears. She was more angry with herself than she was with Naruto, and wanted more than anything to tell him that it wasn't his fault. To tell him that she was the one to blame. It just wasn't in her nature to apologize, let alone cry. She watched him continue his practice from the corner of her eye, wincing slightly at the gloomy frown marring his normally happy face. The shrill whistle from the teapot drew her eyes away from the depressed teenager, and she mournfully poured the hot water over her cup of noodles. Carrying the ramen in one hand, she hesitantly walked over to the blonde and sat down beside him. She stirred the noodles with her chopsticks a few times before lifting a small bite to her mouth. For the most part, her appetite had left her, and it took an incredible amount of willpower to scoop another serving of the salty food into her mouth. The tight constricting of her throat was making it incredibly painful to swallow. He finished sealing the kunai for the 4th time and screwed the top back onto the ink bottle before shooting the girl a wide grin. I wanted to visit all my friends to tell them that I was leaving. You don't have to go if you don't want to. Tayuya frowned at his strained smile and set the cup down onto the ground. It was somewhat obvious that he didn't want her to tag along while he visited his friends. What escaped her was his reason for not wanting her to go. He wasn't that upset about her yelling at him, was he? His eyes were squinched into slits, hiding his emotions and thoughts from view. She stared at him a moment longer before setting her mouth into a firm, angry line. There was no way in hell he was going to leave her cooped up his stuffy apartment while he got to gallivant around town with his friends. I'm gonna change. She hefted herself up onto her feet and walked back towards Naruto's room, leaving a nearly untouched cup of ramen on the floor. As soon as he was sure that she couldn't see him, the blonde's smile dropped almost instantly. He stared down at the uneaten noodles and sighed. It went against his nindo to leave a perfectly good batch of ramen uneaten, so with a quiet, "Itadakimasu," he grabbed her chopsticks and shoveled a mouthful of the salty treat down his throat. For some reason, it was incredibly painful to swallow. Watching Uzumaki Naruto interact with his friends was nothing less than sickening. His mouth was stretched much wider than humanly possible, exposing his sharper than normal canines and every single one of his 28 teeth. What was even more sickening was the fact that his friends failed to notice the strained smiles and laughter of the boisterous blonde, because in her opinion, they were frighteningly easy to see. Then again, she was probably just being overly paranoid because he hadn't spoken more than 10 words to her since they'd left his apartment. The reactions of each of his friends when he arrived was eerily similar. Surprise, then anger, then curiosity, followed by jealousy, and finally happiness. The only ones who hadn't shown all of the aforementioned emotions had been Shikamaru, Shino, Tenten, and Lee. Tenten and Shino because they didn't know that she was one of the Sound Four yet, anyway, and Shikamaru because it would have been too troublesome to give any kind of reaction. Or so he'd said, anyway. Strangely enough, they hadn't been able to find any of the rookie 9 girls, and spent approximately 2 hours walking around the southern part of the village in search of them. After nearly 5 hours of looking for and talking to the rookie 9 minus Sasuke, plus Team Guy, both teens were almost ready to call it quits, Tayuya more so than Naruto. The blonde ball of energy was literally itching to visit the Hyuga mansion to talk to Neji and Hinata about the training mission, and if it weren't for the fact that their home was on top of the largest hill in Konoha, she wouldn't have had a problem with making one last stop. There's no way I'm going up there, she said, gaping up at the hill with no small amount of trepidation. The boy turned to her with an annoyed expression, the grin he'd been sporting for the better part of the day completely wiped off of his face. That's why I said you should stay home. Surprised, Tayuya snapped her head around to look at the normally cheerful blonde. His tone of voice was a mix between cold and bitter, and he stared back at her with slightly resentful eyes. After recovering from her initial shock, the redhead clutched her flute tightly in her left hand before meeting his gaze with a heated one of her own. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Her voice was low and dangerous as she glared over at him, but he only shrugged unsociably and turned back towards the hill. It means you should just go home. He slowly began to walk up the steep hill, scaling it without giving her a backwards glance. She watched him walk away in a mild state of confusion. Not once in the last 3 weeks she'd known him had he ever used such a hostile tone of voice with her, not even when she'd insulted his friends, dreams, or Uilati. She quickly reeled in her emotions and grit her teeth with anger. No one talked to her like that, even if it was sort of her fault. Well, you then, she screamed at his back. I don't need some weak, shitty rat like you anyway. Turning on her heel, she limped off in the opposite direction, radiating killing intent strong enough to scare anyone below Junin level. That sucking bastard, she murmured, still speeding along the sidewalk. She didn't know where she was going, but as long as she was far away from Naruto, it didn't matter. How dare he talk to me like that? Doesn't he know who I am? Next time, I'll put him in a genjutsu so bad his shriveled up balls will drop. Anyone who happened to be walking by wisely avoided getting in the angry girl's way, and she petulantly stared down anyone who didn't. In her mad rampage through the streets of Konoha, she failed to see the woman that had accidentally stepped in front of her. Being the weaker of the two, Tayuya was instantly sent sprawling to the ground, falling hard on her backside and dropping her crutch in the process. She groaned and rubbed at her bottom before checking to make sure that her flute was okay, leaving her other hand to brush the dirt off of her pants. Oh, that's just great. Watch where you're going, you. Tayuya, the woman asked, staring down at the girl with concern. The genin's head snapped up in surprise at the voice. I'm so sorry. Here, let me help you up. Bending down, Shizune easily hefted the redhead to her feet, brushing off some of the dirt that she'd miss. Oh, thanks. She nodded towards the medical ninja and quickly continued on down the street. Maybe if she could get away fast enough, the woman wouldn't ask about. Where's Naruto-kun? Damn it. Glancing over her shoulder, she shrugged carelessly and scowled. Damned if I know. He's probably off playing grab with his faggot friends or something. Being an experienced shinobi, and a woman with common sense, Shizune easily saw through Tayuya's guise. Something bad had happened between them, and thinking quickly, she came up with a plan to squeeze as many details as she could out of the genin. I was just about to grab some lunch. Would you like to join me? My treat, she said, smiling widely at the fuming girl. Tayuya glared suspiciously at the black-haired woman for a few moments, analyzing every ounce of her expression for clues as to her motives. People just didn't offer to buy someone else lunch out of the blue, especially if they weren't even friends. No, that's okay. I'm just gonna go to the training grounds and. Nonsense. Shizune grabbed her arm and pulled her towards the nearest diner. A growing girl such as yourself can't be skipping meals. How else are you going to develop into a woman? A faint blush appeared on the girl's cheeks as she was coerced into taking a seat at one of the booths near the window. She had to admit that the medic Nin had a good point, not that she cared about those kinds of things, and she did skip breakfast that morning. Besides, the restaurant didn't look like that bad of a place to eat. Shinobi and civilians alike sat at the red cloth-colored tables, chatting and laughing amongst themselves about the most trivial of things. The walls were painted a bright eggshell white, and the floor was tiled with varying shades of red and black. It was completely different than any of the restaurants in the Sound Village's many bases, mostly because it was actually clean. She hesitantly picked up one of the large, red-colored pieces of paper resting on the table and began to look it over. So, Shizune started, simultaneously looking over the menu. How are your legs feeling? Tayuya glanced up long enough to meet her eyes before hiding her face back behind the card. It was her first time eating at such a high-end place, to her, anyway, and to be honest, it was a little nerve-wracking. Better. As if accepting the answer, the woman nodded and lowered her menu to the table. That's good. Has Naruto-kun been helping you recuperate? The redhead bristled slightly at the mention of the Kyuubi cantainer's name, a fact which didn't go unnoticed by the Hokage's apprentice. Tayuya cleared her throat noisily and acted as disinterestedly as she could to ease the woman's curiosity. Nah, that not good for much. She lowered the piece of paper and met Shizune's curious gaze. What can I get? Shizune stared at her confusedly for a few seconds before a look of understanding ped over her face. Oh, anything you want. It's my treat, after all. She suddenly leaned forward onto her elbows until her nose was almost touching the girl's and smiled mischievously. But only if you tell me what's going on with you and Naruto-kun. The redhead bit back a curse. She knew something like this would happen. Although she wanted nothing more than to tell the woman to go herself, her stomach had other ideas. The aroma of the food coming from the kitchen was like a powerful drug, compelling her to blindly agree to the wicked witch's demands. Crossing her arms under her chest, she scowled and sat back in her seat. I can order anything, she asked, glaring at the evil woman sitting across from her. Shizune's grin widened as she nodded her ent. Fine. It's not like I give a shit about it anyway. With an ecstatic squeal, the medic Nin motioned for one of the waitresses to come over to the table. Hi. The waitress chirped as she skipped over to the table. What can I get for you? She held a small pen and pad in her hands, waiting anxiously to take their orders. Her big green eyes shone with an innocence only seen in normal civilians, and her long black hair seemed to shimmer with every small movement she made. Tayuya sniffed in slight jealousy at the woman's generous ETS, before nearly shoving the menu into the waitress's face. I want this, 2 of these, 4 of those, this, and the biggest cup of tea you got, she yelled, pointing excitedly to various items on the menu. She smugly glanced over towards Shizune to gauge her expression, and much to her annoyance, she didn't seem fazed in the least. Oh, and you miss? The waitress asked, more than a little surprised at the redhead's large order. The medic Nin just waved her hand and smiled. A cup of tea will be fine, thank you. Bowing to the kunoichi, the woman hurriedly skipped away from the table to relay their orders. As soon as she was out of hearing distance, Shizune leaned forward again and lowered her voice. So, what happened? Start from the beginning. Aing told you, it wasn't that big of a deal. Shizune frowned and crossed her arms unbelievingly, shooting the girl a stern glare. Talk. Tayuya hung her head and sighed. Well, I was teaching him how to seal a kunai, and then I kind of yelled at him. When the woman's frown deepened, she quickly held out a hand. But it wasn't my fault. He deserved it. Frowning disbelievingly, Shizune lifted a curious eyebrow. What did he do? I don't know, he was too close. He was like 2 inches away from my face, so I told him to back the off, she said, a small blush appearing on her face. That's all. I don't think Naruto-kun would be upset over something that small. What exactly did you say? Tayuya averted her gaze and scowled. I can't remember. Nodding cordially to the girl, Shizune stood up from the table. Hey, where the hell are you going? Taking slow steps towards the door, she glanced over her shoulder nonchalantly. If you're not going to be honest, then I'm not paying for your food. But I don't have any money. Sounds like a personal problem. Bye. Tayuya felt her stomach painfully constrict in hunger once more, and gritting her teeth in agony, she lowered her head in defeat. Fine. I told him to go away, and not to touch me. That's it. Okay. Shizune turned around with a sad smile on her face. Oh, Tayuya, is that all? When the girl nodded, she seated herself and compassionately grabbed one of the redhead's hands. Surprised by the strange feeling, Tayuya quickly pulled her hand out of the woman's grip and placed it in her lap. I see you're not used to human contact. Is that why you yelled at Naruto-kun? She stiffened slightly at the accusation but slowly nodded again, evoking an angry sigh from the medic nin. That Orochimaru, look, Tayuya, I know you might find this hard to believe, but Naruto-kun isn't used to affectionate human contact either. Bullshit. The girl yelled, drawing the attention of nearby diners. Most of them frowned at her use of obvious profanity, but a few looked over at her with a curious gaze. She scowled back at them and lowered her voice. He has plenty of friends. How can he not be used to human contact? Yes, he has a lot of friends now, but that wasn't always the case. He didn't have anyone until he graduated from the academy. Tayuya skeptically narrowed her eyes. This shit wasn't making any sense. What the hell does that have to do with me? I know you didn't mean to, but you probably hurt Naruto-kun when you told him not to touch you. He's been told that for the majority of his life, and hearing it come from someone he considers a friend probably cut him deeper than any of the words that could ever come from the villagers. No way. What about that pink-haired bitch? From what I hear, she tells him to off all the time. Why does he get upset when I tell him to? A small, devilish smirk appeared on the woman's face, immediately setting the girl on edge. Perhaps he considers you more of a friend than Sakura-chan. Tayuya frowned thoughtfully, resting her chin on her hands. Still, how can he call me a friend? I haven't done shit for him in the whole 3 weeks that I've been here. Yes, you have. Unlike most of the other people who know his secret, you see him as Naruto, not as the, well, you know. I'm not telling you to apologize, but at least let him know why you said the things that you did. The redhead sighed and stared contemplatively out of the window. Friend, huh, for Tayuya, it was extremely hard to believe that someone would ever consider her one of their friends. Although she'd never admit it in a million years, she honestly didn't think that she had any redeeming qualities whatsoever. She was rude, full-mouthed, callous, and uncaring towards everyone and everything. What the hell could anyone ever see in her? At that moment, the waitress returned with a large tray of food, stacked high with sushi, dango, rice, cake, and an assortment of other different things. Shizune's smile dropped as she eyed the large amount of food, and she looked over at the girl with an incredulous expression. Are you really going to eat all of that? She asked, her eyebrows inching higher with each plate that was set down in front of them. The redhead excitedly lifted her eyes to meet the medic nin's own. She couldn't explain it, but for some reason, she'd been annoyingly hungry for the last couple of days. Yeah I am. Naruto scaled the hill with relative ease, gradually building his smile with each step. He really hadn't meant to be so mean to Tayuya, and was deeply regretting letting her go off by herself. There was no guarantee that there weren't any more sound ninja in the village, and for all he knew, one could be attack her right now. Panicking, he quickly turned on his heel to head back down the hill. Naruto, what are you doing here? The blonde froze mid-step before slowly turning around to see Hyuga Neji approaching from the other side of the hill. Immediately, he pulled a wide foxy grin onto his face and sheepishly scratched the back of his head. Oh, hey Neji, I was just, coming to see you. The Hyuga narrowed his eyes, causing a small sweat drop to appear on the back of Naruto's head. While Neji had certainly mellowed out within the last few months, he could still be pretty intimidating when he wanted to. If I recall correctly, you were heading in the opposite direction. Yeah, because I was walking up the hill backwards. It's a secret training method Ero Sennin taught me. Neji blinked stupidly at the blonde for a few seconds. Surely Naruto didn't think he was dumb enough to fall for such an obvious lie. Sighing deeply, he shook his head and walked towards the high outer walls of the Hyuga mansion. Follow me, he said, giving the boy no room for argument. Naruto glanced over his shoulder once more in defeat before hanging his head and following the prodigy onto the property. Despite what he'd heard about the Hyuga clan from others, he was surprised to find that the Byakugan users were actually pretty lax. The guards posted inside the walls of the compound only spared him a curious glance as he ped, and a few of them even gave him a nod recognition. Out of all the scenarios he had come up with in his head, this one was the least expected. As he followed the long, concrete path leading to the front door, he visibly gawked at the large amount of flowers and trees planted throughout the yard. There were many different colors, shapes, and species littered throughout the yard, and if it weren't for the narrow walkway below him, he was sure that he would have gotten lost. A small clearing of the throat snapped him out of his thoughts, and he looked up to see Neji waiting impatiently on the steps in front of the door. Seeing that he had his attention, he opened the tall oak door of the mansion and motioned for the blonde to enter ahead of him. Naruto hesitantly stepped into the building and let loose an astonished gasp. If he thought the garden was impressive, the halls of the Hyuga estate were positively breathtaking. The ceiling was every bit of 20 feet high, and the floors were polished to the point of gleaming perfection. Old pictures adorned the walls of the foyer, and remembering what he'd learned about the clan during one of Iruka-sensei's lessons, he wasn't asleep all of the time, correctly Yumed that they were the previous clan heads. They walked for a few more minutes, making a turn or changing directions every now and then. Finally, the genin reached a large Fusuma door. What's this? Naruto asked, staring up at the door with no small amount of trepidation. He wasn't completely at ease yet being within the Hyuga mansion, even if he had Neji as an escort. Especially since he knew that the older clan heads weren't exactly fond of him. Neji slid the door open and pointed towards one of the large pillows resting in front of a low table. The room was mostly empty, barring a few sculptures and plants positioned tastefully around the edges of the small guest room. A large screen window was built on the southern wall, giving them a perfect view of the lake in the backyard. Sit there. Nodding, the blonde quickly plopped down onto the cushion, crossing his legs underneath him in the process. Neji did the same, and with an invasive stare unique to the Hyuga clan, straightened his back to look Naruto directly in the eye. What is your reason for coming here? He asked, unable to hide the small bit of curiosity lurking in his eyes. Why did we have to come all the to this room? I could have told you outside. A sudden flash of fear ped over the normally stoic Hyuga's face, but it was quickly covered up with a glare of indifference and a small clearing of the throat. It is safer inside. Naruto almost asked what he meant by safer, but the dark aura emanating from his friend was more than enough to shut him up. Oh, well, where's Hinata-chan? I have to tell her too. Naruto let loose a small breath of relief when Neji's expression changed into a thoughtful one. She hasn't been feeling well. Rest assured, I will relay the message to her as soon as possible. Satisfied, the Jinchuriki nodded and leaned back onto his hands. I guess that's okay, even though I'd rather tell her myself. Anyway, I just wanted to let you know that I'd be gone on a training mission for 3 years. I'm leaving on Friday morning. The prodigy's eyebrows shot up behind his forehead protector, and except for a slight widening of the eyes, there were no other visible signs that he was at all surprised. I see. With Jiraiya-sama, I presume. The blonde slowly nodded again. And a couple of other people. I don't know who one of them is, but the other is a girl who's really good with genjutsu. She's kinda smart, too. Neji's eyes narrowed at Naruto's strained grin, and he leaned forward onto his elbows. Threading his fingers in a very Sasuke-esque pose, he stared curiously into the blonde's eyes. So, she's your friend. What rank is she? She's a genin like me, and she's not really my friend. The Hyuga lifted a shocked eyebrow. Being a friend of Naruto himself, he knew exactly how magnetic the boy could be. The fact that someone, anyone, could avoid becoming one of his friends was more than hard to believe. She's not. Why? Out of all the questions he was expecting, that one wasn't even on his radar. He blinked a few times to regain his thoughts and looked over at Neji with a confused frown. Well, because she doesn't like me, I guess. She doesn't. Why not? I dunno, she just doesn't. There has to be a reason. The prodigy nearly smirked at the range of emotions crossing over the blonde's face. While most people wouldn't pick up on the subtle change in expressions, the Hyuga clan specialized in reading their targets. This girl obviously had a large impact on Naruto, and being the good nosy friend he was, he would do his best to help the clueless genin out. There isn't. The Jinchuriki yelled, becoming annoyed with the cross-examination. He couldn't understand why Neji was so adamant about finding out what was wrong, or why the prodigy wasn't being fooled by his usually perfect mask. I think there is. Naruto, my eyes see everything. It is obvious to me that this girl is an important person to you, and you're hurt that she doesn't seem to want to be your friend. Am I correct? Naruto lowered his head, hiding his eyes behind his bangs. The blunt way in which he said it made him feel even worse, and he turned his head to look out of the large window. I guess. Neji's lips twitched with accomplishment. Apparently, his skills hadn't dulled at all during his stay in Hell, the hospital. He leaned back and crossed his arms, closing his eyes in thought. Although he probably wasn't the best person to be giving anyone advice on friendship, he'd certainly learned a few things by watching the interaction of people around him. After a few seconds of silence, he opened his eyes and regarded the blonde with a stoic stare. It's not like you to just give up, Naruto. What happened to making everyone acknowledge you? What happened to becoming the Hokage? If you can't even make one girl become your friend, what kind of man will you be? Naruto snapped his head around to look at the Hyuga genius, shock evident on his face. His shock soon gave way to sadness, and he looked down at his hands in defeat. But it's not that easy. She said she doesn't want me around. Becoming fed up with Naruto's angst, Neji slammed his fist onto the table. Damn it, Naruto, it's not supposed to be easy. Are you going to give up just like that? You're even more pathetic than I thought. If she's really that important to you, fight for her friendship. An eerie silence settled over the room after Neji's outburst, and neither shinobi spoke for what seemed like hours. Naruto slowly lifted his head to stare straight into the white eyes of his friend with a small, genuine smile on his face. Thanks, Neji. He slowly got to his feet and turned towards the door. Sorry, but I got something that I need to do right now. Make sure you tell Hinata-chan for me. The Hyuga nodded, smirking as his friend slid the door open and sprinted down the hall towards the exit. He then stared out of the large screen window to his left at the brightly shining sun, watching as it slowly revealed itself from behind a large cluster of clouds. Do your best, Naruto. An orange blur raced down the halls of the Hyuga mansion, expertly navigating the pathways as if he'd lived there for years. Luckily, he'd had the foresight to pick out landmarks in each corridor just in case he was separated from Neji. He reached the front doors in a matter of minutes and threw them open before rushing past the surprised guards standing in the front yard. A few of them yelled for him to slow down, but by the time they began to run in his direction, he was already outside of the tall, metal gates and heading down the hill in the direction he'd come. It had been just under an hour since they'd separated, and knowing Tayuya's current speed on crutches, there was no way she could have gotten very far. He speedily rounded the corner, only to knock something soft and light to the ground. God damn it. Watch where you're going, hole. Shit. You leaf motherers just step out of in. Tayuya. The girl in question looked up to see Naruto staring down at her with concern, and for a second, she felt a strong wave of déjà vu. There wasn't a trace of anger and coldness left on his face, and she inquisitively wondered what had happened in the hour she'd been gone. She grabbed his offered hand and easily hefted herself up to her feet, nervously avoiding his gaze as she stood. Her heart rate unconsciously sped up as she replayed the events of the past hour in her head. As she'd ate, Shizune had been giving her tips and advice on how to approach Naruto about their fight. Being the hard head that she was, she had either ignored or rejected every one of the woman's ideas. Now that she was here, she was really starting to regret it. Just as she was about to open her mouth, the blonde sighed loudly and put on a small smile. I'm really glad you're okay, Tayuya. The redhead blinked a few times in shock. The same sickly feeling in the bottom of her stomach from that morning was coming back full force, and she said the most intelligent thing she could in her current position. What? Chuckling softly to himself, Naruto scratched the back of his head and widened his grin. I was kinda worried that someone might attack you or something, and I was just coming to find you. She frowned confusedly and narrowed her eyes. You always say you're worried about me. Why? Well, because you're suddenly remembering what had happened earlier, the blonde quickly shut his mouth and changed the subject. Never mind. So, why are you here? Taken aback by the sudden question, Tayuya crossed her arms under her chest and shot him a half-hearted glare. For the same reason. You can't do shit without me, and I just wanted to make sure you didn't get yourself killed. Not that I care if you die or anything. If it weren't for the fact that she would kill him on the spot, he would have laughed at her words. Maybe she did care a little about him after all. I'm tired, and it'll be sundown by the time we walk all the way back to the other side of Konoha. Let's go home. She turned around and limped off in the opposite direction, fighting the persistent smirk that threatened to break out on her face. Walking along behind her, Naruto cheerfully watched her back, not bothering to hide his grin. Yeah, let's go home. If it was possible, the shower felt 10 times better than it had the day before. She savored every second of it, knowing that in a couple of days she'd be on the road and forced to take baths in cold rivers and streams. After rinsing the soap off of her body, she turned the handle on the wall to save some hot water for Naruto and stepped out of the small stall. She didn't bother to dry herself off this time, and instead just slipped on the same shirt and boxers she'd borrowed the night before. Your turn, Tayuya yelled, stepping out of the bathroom and closing the door behind her. The cool air in the apartment felt deliciously comfortable against her skin, and she stretched her arms high above her head to further intensify the feeling. If she wasn't careful, she could get too used to living in Naruto's apartment. She lowered her arms and slowly walked into the kitchen for a snack, nodding towards the blonde as he ped her on his way to the bathroom. It hadn't even been 3 hours since she'd shared a meal with Shizune, and her stomach was already demanding food. She grabbed a cup of shrimp ramen, it was one of the many flavors she'd never had the displeasure of tasting, and set it down next to the stove, filling the kettle with water before setting it down on the burner. As she waited, she listened for the sound of water splashing against the wall in the bathroom, signaling to her that Naruto had finally started his shower. For a few minutes, the entire apartment was silent except for the gentle pitter-patter of the shower. She was nearly caught off guard when the pot began to whistle and hiss, and with a swiftness only seen in shinobi, removed the kettle from the burner and poured a large amount of water into the cup of ramen. She stirred the salty noodles with her chopsticks a few times, helping the food along in its cooking. Just as she was about to lift a small amount of the food to her mouth, a loud banging was heard from the front door. Who the hell could that be? Tayuya wondered aloud. She picked up her searing cup of ramen and slowly made her way towards the door. Since she was living in his apartment for free, the redhead figured that she could at least get the door for him. Placing her free hand on the doorknob, she slowly twisted it to her right, swinging it open to stare straight into a pair of cornflower blue eyes. Both teens stared tensely at each other for a few seconds, obviously surprised to see the other standing there. Finally becoming bored with the situation, Tayuya menacingly narrowed her eyes. "What the do you want?" she asked, eyeing the girl with no small amount of malice. There was something about the blonde-haired girl that bugged her, and she couldn't help but feel that they'd met somewhere before. "This is Naruto's apartment, right?" Ino asked, completely brushing off the redhead's question. She was fairly certain that this was where the blonde lived, and seeing the girl's reaction to her question only confirmed her beliefs. "Is he here?" Frowning, Tayuya tightened her grip on the doorknob. "I'm not obligated to tell you shit. Bye." Before she could close the door, the Yamanaka slammed her hand against the panel. "I don't think you understand," she started, stepping forward into the apartment. "I'm here to see Naruto." "Where is he?" Shocked by the girl's audacity, she moved directly in front of the aggressive blonde. She didn't look to weigh more than 110 pounds, and even in her weakened state, she was certain that she could easily kick the girl's flat. "No, I don't think you understand, you piss-haired, air-headed valley girl. If you ever do something like that again, I'll kill you." The two girls glared furiously into each other's eyes, daring the other to make the next move. After a few seconds of staring, Ino deepened her frown and glared down at the irritable Kunoichi. "What are you, his girlfriend or something?" Not expecting the question, Tayuya sputtered out the first thing she could think of. "And no. No." A large, conspiratorial smirk spread across the blonde's face. "Oh, so you don't mind if I take him off of your hands then?" she inquired, leaning forward to further pressure the already off-balance redhead. "No, well, yeah, but, just shut up." Unfortunately, they were so wrapped up in their conflict that neither one managed to sense the boy in question approaching from behind Tayuya. "Ino-chan, what are you doing here?" he asked, a towel draped haphazardly over his shoulders. He was wearing a large pair of black sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt, and his hair was in a miv state of disarray. The redhead's grip on the doorknob tightened, and Ino swore she could hear the cheap metal bending under her fist. "Ino-chan," she spat, her face becoming even angrier than it had been only seconds before. Naruto nodded and put on his infamous foxy grin. "Yep, she's the one that helped me pick out those flowers for you. She's really good at it, too." Ino grinned modestly and stepped back from the doorway. "Thank you, Naruto-kun." She flashed to Yuya a smug smile, rubbing salt into an already festering wound. "Sorry for coming by so late, but I was wondering if we could talk for a little while." Ino glanced at the redhead again and frowned. Alone. Every muscle in Tayuya's body was begging her to claw the girl's eyes out, and if it weren't for the fact that Naruto was standing right beside her, she would have done just that. How dare this bitch come out of nowhere and demand that Naruto give her the time of day? Not that she cared, of course. Besides, knowing him, he wouldn't want to talk to her any. "Sure. Just let me put on my sandals." Tayuya's jaw dropped open at how easily he agreed. She watched amazed as he slipped into his shoes and headed out of the door, giving her a wave and his trademark grin as he walked down the stairs with the blonde succubus from hell. So appalled at the quickness with which he'd accepted Ino's proposal, Tayuya didn't notice the crushed ramen cup in her hand, nor the copious amounts of scalding hot soup spilling over onto her fingers. She did, however, notice the sinking feeling in her chest as she watched them leave. Uzumaki Naruto and Yamanaka Ino strolled down the dark streets of Konoha. It was just as quiet as it had been the night before, and if it weren't for the lights beaming from the windows of the houses lining the streets, one would think they were the last two people in the village. A small, awkward silence settled over the blondes, and feeling slightly bad about leaving Tayuya alone in the apartment, Naruto shot her a curious glance. "What did you want to talk about?" he asked, clasping his hands behind his head. Ino jolted a bit at the suddenness of his question, and she stared blankly at him for a few seconds before putting on a nervous smile. "Nothing special, really," she lied, waving her hands in a disarming fashion. Noticing the dubious expression on his face, she hurriedly said the next thing that came to her mind. "So, that's Tayuya. Happy to have something he could talk about." Naruto enthusiastically nodded his head. "Yup. Those flowers really worked. It only took her a day to get better." The girl's smile became strained as she remembered how hard she'd worked on that bouquet, only for the flowers to go to someone who was bitchy and unappreciative. Frowning a bit, the Yamanaka slowed her pace and crossed her arms over her chest. "Did she at least thank you?" When the boy shook his head, Ino sighed agitatedly. Why he bothered to hang out with a girl like that was beyond her. Hell, if a guy she didn't even know gave her a beautiful bouquet of flowers, she'd at least thank him before shooting him down. Deciding to make her concerns known, she furrowed her brows and glared at Naruto. "Then why do you even hang out with her? If she can't even open her mouth to thank you for going out of your way to buy her some flowers, why bother with her?" To her surprise, the genin's grin only grew. "Because she's like me." Ino's eyes widened for a split second at his words. She turned her eyes to the sidewalk in front of them, contemplating what he meant by his statement. As far as she knew, the two didn't have that much in common. Although they were both loud and rude, Naruto was much nicer than the perpetually angry redhead. He didn't swear nearly as often as she did, and if he could, he'd always be there to lend a helping hand. Sure, he was stupid, but at least he genuinely cared about his friends and those close to him. From what she'd heard about the girl from Shikamaru, Tayuya was the complete opposite. For one, she was much smarter than the average shinobi. Being able to keep up with the lazy Chunin in brainpower was no easy feat, and according to the deer herder himself, she could probably outmaneuver him if the situation was life or death. Another thing she'd learned from her teammate was that the girl had an incredibly low opinion of other people, especially since she had no qualms about insulting the Hokage to her face. So what could he possibly mean by, "because she's like me"? At that moment, she remembered what he'd said about Tayuya when they were in the flower shop. He'd called her strong-willed and independent, and he'd also mentioned that she didn't take shit from anyone. At least that explained the redhead's rudeness when she greeted her at the door. Still, she found herself becoming increasingly jealous of the Naruto's new friend. She was just as, if not more, strong-willed than Tayuya, and much better looking too. To her, the girl looked more like a drowned sewer rat than an actual person. "Isn't this where you live?" Naruto asked, snapping her out of her thoughts. Looking around, she realized that they'd walked all the way from his apartment to the market district. She made a small guttural sound of disgust in the back of her throat. Her plan had originally been to win the boy over with her feminine charms, not get him to take her back home. Confused by her sudden frown, he leaned a little bit closer to get her attention. "Ino-chan. Oh, yeah, thanks. But, I kind of wanted to hang out for a little while. Do you have time?" She batted her eyelashes for added effect. Unsurprisingly, He completely missed her attempt at being persuasive and smiled at her with an apologetic grin. Sorry, Ino-chan, but I really can't stay out too late. Me and Tayuya have to get up really early to pack and shop for supplies. Ino's eyebrows shot up at the mention of packing. Packing? For what? Oh yeah, I didn't tell you yet. Naruto exclaimed. We're going on a 3-year training mission with Arrow Sennin Friday. I'm gonna get really strong and bring Sasuke back, don't worry. The Yamanaka felt her jaw drop open at this sudden piece of information. Her brain was going at 1,000,000 miles an hour trying to process his words, yet nothing was making sense. Taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes to help herself relax. Hold on. So, you and Tayuya are going a training mission, alone, for 3 years. Huh, no, Arrow Sennin and another Junin will be there too. Ino's eyes lowered to her feet. All of her plans, schemes, and ideas to turn Naruto into the perfect boyfriend were useless now that he was leaving, and she couldn't help but feel a large amount of hate for the full-mouthed redhead. Anyway, I should probably get going. We're leaving Friday morning, so come see of us off, okay? He hopped off of the front steps of the flower shop and jogged back towards the residential district, waving an arm as he ran. She could only watch as he blended in with shadows of the night, and after she was sure he was gone, she leaned heavily against the front door of the shop. Perhaps it was for the best. Maybe this was Kami's way of telling her that she wasn't ready for him yet, or that she needed to train herself in becoming a respectable kunoichi before she could even hope to be on the same level Naruto. She clenched her fist tightly in determination before raising it to the sky. She had a new goal now, and nothing and no one would stand in her way. I won't lose to you. The blonde yelled at the top of her lungs, staring decisively into the starlit sky. It felt great to scream to the heavens, and at that moment, she felt as if she was on top of the world. She'd train as hard as she could for the next 3 years, and when Naruto returned, he wouldn't know what hit him. Ino-chan, is that you? Come inside before you catch a cold. Her feeling of accomplishment thoroughly defeated by her mother's interruption, Ino dropped her head and sighed. Yes, mother. Naruto skillfully scaled the stairs of his apartment building. It had only been a little over 45 minutes since he'd left with Ino, but he was already worried that something had happened to her. Only one other person lived in the old, rundown building with him, and she was old enough to be considered dust. If an Oto nin wanted to attack her, now would be the perfect time to try it. Not that Tayuya was completely defenseless, she did have the use of both of her arms now, and could easily perform hand seals or play her flute. Still, her legs weren't strong enough to support her if she had to make a run for it, and the ability to move was a shinobi's greatest defense. He quickly unlocked the door and peered inside of the apartment. The light in the hallway was off, and except for a small glow coming from around the corner, the room was pitch black. He slipped off his ninja sandals and quietly made his way to the living room. Tayuya, are you in here? He whispered, tiptoeing into the room. The only light in the room came from a single lamp resting on the table near the couch, and as he got closer, he noticed a small shadow huddled against the arm of the beat-up sofa. The redhead was curled up into a little ball, her hair resting haphazardly on the cushions. He kneeled down next to her head to see that she was fast asleep, her breaths coming in deep, even sighs. As he watched her sleep, he forgot that she was a rude, full-mouthed kunoichi. Her lips were cutely puffed out into a small pout, and her face was softened into the perfect picture of comfort. Every now and then, she'd whimper and furrow her brows, mumbling something unintelligible as she moved to find a more comfortable position. He considered picking her up and moving her back to his bed, but remembering what happened the last time he'd gotten too close while she slept, she had a killer left hook, decided against it. Instead, he jogged into his room and grabbed both of their sheets and pillows. Naruto spread his bedding out on the floor next to the couch, remembering her confession about being afraid to sleep alone. He then carefully maneuvered a pillow under her head and gently covered her with a bed sheet, being careful not to set off her violent reflexes. Satisfied with his work, the blonde watched amused as she smiled and snuggled deeper into the chair, obviously a lot more comfortable than she had been only a few seconds before. "You didn't have to wait up for me, you know," he whispered, turning off the lamp and lying down on his own makeshift bed. There was something oddly comforting about having another person close by as he slept, a feeling he didn't get to feel often, except during missions with his team, anyway. Yawning widely, he slowly closed his eyes and smiled.